Hello and welcome to the Happy Musicians Podcast, where it's not about getting the gig, it's about enjoying the gig. I'm your host, Tanner Guss, and in this two-part episode, I am joined by Courtney Isaiah Smith. Courtney is born and raised in the state of Utah, and he is an unbelievable keyboardist. He's a composer and a vocalist and a historian. He admits this in the interview, but he doesn't talk very much on gigs. And it was really fun to have this interview with him and be pleasantly surprised at how much of a talker he is once he gets going. This episode is different than ones I've done before. Although in part one we do talk a lot about his experience with music, as a whole, this two-part episode is essentially a interpretation and overview of American history from the Black American perspective. And that might sound a little off-brand, but I really don't think so. First and foremost, because an entire segment of the population right now, as a result of systemic racism, is hampered from having a happy and fulfilling life, which is what we're trying to help you accomplish on this show. And as white people, when we try to qualify or ignore or tame down that reality, it causes a lot of shame and frustration. And the only way that we're going to get past this is if we have these conversations and we take the time to understand history from all perspectives. And that doesn't, in the same sense that when I admit that I rush medium up tempos or I play too loud, that doesn't make me a bad musician. It means that I'm giving myself permission to work on those things. And admitting that our interpretation of history is incorrect or that we have racial biases doesn't make us terrible people. It means that we are giving ourselves permission to become better people and try to understand Black Americans, and that's what I'm trying to do with this episode. Before we get into it, I want to say two things. First, I think it's important that right now, white Americans are taking the time to just listen, not trying to share our opinions, but just opening our ears and listening, just being present and taking in information from Black Americans and trying to understand their perspective, especially if you, like myself, are a white musician playing Black American music. And if you're trying to make a living and get support and information and history and power and spirit and soul from the Black American community, then I think you have an obligation to give back to that community and support them and stand with Black Lives Matter and learn history from their perspective and support them in the same way that they're supporting you. The second thing I want to say is that we live in a time right now where so many arguments are based on social media and are based off of articles that people read on social media or that they just read the headlines. And I think during a pandemic where we don't have the excuse of not having enough time to do something, we should take advantage of this and sit down and read entire books and full-length journal articles and watch movies and listen to full-length podcasts and get entire perspectives so that we're informed about what people are really trying to say instead of arguing over sound bites. So I hope this podcast is helpful. I learned a lot from this, and it was humbling, and I am excited to share with you. So I appreciate you taking the time and the energy to listen to this, and please help me welcome Courtney Isaiah Smith. Isaiah Smith, welcome to the Happy Musicians Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So I think we're like a week into what's been a pretty stressful time.
To say the least.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if you were, like what you were doing, because you're living right downtown.
Yeah.
And so it was Saturday evening in Salt Lake that the riot happened here, and or the protest. I guess it depends on the news headline you read. But I was my family has a lot up in Big Cottonwood Canyon. So we were up there just with friends, roasting marshmallows and stuff, and then we all got alerts on our phone like, oh my God, like this is happening.
Yeah.
Had no idea. And so I'm maybe just curious, where were you? Were you just home when all that was happening, or?
Surprisingly enough, it was my mom's birthday that day. So we were at her house. She lives, she lives on like 9th East, and I call it Martin Luther King Boulevard. I mean, 600 South for those who've always lived here, but to me, it's Martin Luther King Boulevard. So she's kind of at the outskirts of downtown, but that's where we were. We were at her house celebrating her birthday, but at the same time, we were aware of, we had saw the news reports, and we were on our phones, and we were checking clips and interviews, and so we had been tracking everything that's happened from the George Floyd execution up to this point.
Right.
So we were very aware of it, and we were, as a matter of fact, my cousin, his name is Daniel Johnson, and he's a student at or was a student at Salt Lake Community College, and he was actually at the protest. He had gone earlier in the day, but I think as time went on, he actually went home. So we were very aware of what was going on. I don't think we were prepared for what we saw. But seeing it kind of made the issue even more real, and it put a perspective of just the racial elements here in this state that often don't get addressed, even with respect to what's going on in Minneapolis. And so we were very, very aware of that.
Right.
think. Yeah.
Well, that's one thing that's interesting about like the experience here in Salt Lake City, and just in Utah, and this kind of whole mountain time area of the U.S.
Yeah.
Where it's a younger part of the Western influence on America.
Sure. Yeah.
Since it was, I don't know how to say it, since it was occupied.
Right.
And it just is much less diverse.
Yeah.
So I don't think we have some of the same tensions. And maybe I'm just curious what your experience has been growing, because you grew up here, right?
Oh, yeah, I'm a son of Salt Lake City, yes.
Yeah. And so what has your maybe experience been like growing up, and the influences of institutionalized racism that you've experienced, and how you think your experiences may be different from people growing up in places where it's more overt?
Well, I've always looked back on my own experience as very unique, because I've always kind of lived in two separate societies. If you're a black person who's grown up in a predominantly white city, white state, but you were cognizant of the fact that your people are around. For instance, I grew up on, I would say, the Lower East Side of Salt Lake. I grew up in the 9th and 9th district. That's where I grew up, and I was aware of the fact early on that I was in a white neighborhood. Like, I just knew it early on. All our neighbors pretty much were white. I mean, I had like a Vietnamese neighbor who lived like in an apartment building down the street from me, and there were some black kids that I went to school with. But by and large, we knew we were kind of like just a few. And if you wanted to find black people or people of color, you had to go to what they call the West Side. So you had to go everything west of West Temple to find people that looked like you, right? Mm-hmm. And so literally it was like living two separate lives in a way, or at least having to operate in two cultures. So I was always the black nerd, 'cause I was into the Ninja Turtles. I was into all this stuff, that you grow up with as a kid. But at the same time, I was going to a predominantly white school. But then on the weekends, I would, or at family functions, I would be around my people. And I understood early on that there are two separate cultures at work. And for me, I had to learn how to operate in both. I had to learn how to speak regular vernacular English, but then I also had to know how to speak the language of my people, which in a way is a covert language, because it's spoken past a consciousness that the majority, quote unquote, of America doesn't really pick up on. There's certain things that we say and our mannerisms that they just go right past sort of the public consciousness, for lack of a better term.
Okay.
So growing up, I understood that I had to navigate in both societies. And then when I started to become a musician, removing just the racial element for a minute, I understood that musicians in Utah are treated differently. And what I mean by that is, say like if you're in a wedding band or you're in a cover band and you arrive on to a gig, to play like a wedding or something, or a corporate function, you're looked at as the help. You're either looked at as the help, or you're looked at as, that what you're doing is a hobby. People don't see the amount of money that you spend on gas to drive to where you're going, and especially in a place where Utah, where sometimes the nearest place is sometimes like a 15-minute drive.
Yeah.
So you're either looked at as that. Now, couple that, that you're looked at either as the help or that what you're doing is a hobby. Couple that with the fact that you're black. And so what you have to imagine is me, 10 years ago, arriving in places like, I don't know, pick the Grand America, or, some of the ritzier hotels up in Park City, let's say, places like that. And you get this look sometimes that you don't belong there, that you have no business being there, And for me, being sort of having a stockier build, being a little bit taller, and I'm, medium black complected, people are looking at me like, what's this big black burly dude doing with this gear, tugging this dolly behind? Is he taking, I really would get looks like that. And then I would watch as I would perform, I would go on and do the gig, and then I would watch the attitudes of the people that I was playing for change by the end of the night. That speaks to the power of music, in that it might be the last vestige between white and black people in this country that unites us, if we use it correctly. Because by the end of the night, those same people who look at me as though I had no business being there were coming up to me and going, "Oh my gosh, you're so talented. I had, almost kind of like, I had no idea that you did this." But it's, they kind of had to get past those preconceived notions, and the art of performance of music kind of forced the removal of those preconceived notions. So it was a trip. It's a trip. When you're in that situation, that you're a black person growing up in a predominantly white society. I mean, I even remember, to your point about, instances of racism. The thing with it, I think, in Utah is that it's not overt. It's not, if black people are speaking a coded language, so are white people in Utah, in a sense. They're kind of speaking a coded language. And I remember one time I was with my mother in a grocery store, and we were in the checkout line. You were in the paying for whatever it was. There was this old lady in front of me, old white lady in front of me, and I'm just standing there. We're just waiting to move forward in the line, and my mom happened to be over here behind me, and I happened to be at the front of the line because I had to grab whatever we were, buying, and then take it out in the bags. So I was in front. The lady's in front of me, and she kind of looked at the corner of her eye and saw that I was a teenager at that point, but in her eyes, a black man is next to her, and she kind of just clutched her purse. And that was one of the instances where it hit for me that, Dr. King's dream might not be the reality that everybody wants us to believe that it is, because this white lady next to me assumes that in a checkout line in the store, you don't go in the checkout line unless you're paying for whatever it is that you're getting.
Right. And
we're in the checkout line, and she's looking at me like I'm going to steal from her, And in my mind, I was like, what would I take? and why would I do it in the, why would I do it in the most obvious place for, that would be the one place for a theft not to occur, would be in where everybody could be looking. So that was when that was one of the instances in which I became aware of you know, covert racism. And then as I got older, I began to study about, you know, institutionalized racism and how the original sin of America is still played out in the socioeconomic order. So it's an interesting situation. It's a very, very interesting situation because it's so intertwined with every part of everybody's life, you know, every day, and in instances that we don't see, and then in instances in which we just naturally operate, but that we're not aware of.
Yeah. Well, and so one thing you said was how, like, when you played music, people finally started, like, maybe just like valuing you or seeing you as a normal person. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of musicians feel that way growing up, where it's the one thing that when they do, like, people's eyes light up and they get attention and they're validated by society, and that can lead to music being like your only sense of worth. Yeah. You know, and it's tied into your identity. Yeah. And did that hit you? And then it being like the one thing that was having you seen as equal in the situation, did it become a big part of your identity in a problematic way?
Well, what's interesting is music has always been a way for me, just as a person, to say or to express and feel what I wasn't allowed to, or what I didn't allow myself to express and feel, and lend voice to. And what's interesting is that there's all different kinds of musicians. You know, there are ones that work hard and, you know, and shed for hours and hours and hours to get to a certain skill set. And then there are the other type that are kind of, they're born with an innate gift that just has to be kind of cultivated and kind of stirred. And so what's interesting about that, I'm from that kind of group. I was playing at 3 years old. Mm-hmm. So I was from that group, which is not to say that I didn't work hard. I worked as hard as anybody else in terms of like practicing and shedding and studying, knowing my craft. I did study, but there was always that sense that I just knew what sounded good.
Yeah, you had a connection.
Yeah, I had an early tactile connection with sound. Mm-hmm. And so I remember when I was getting ready to graduate high school, my teacher's name was Ken Green, and he was probably the biggest influence on my formative life. And he told me when I was getting ready to go into college, an interesting thing that he told me, and he never even, it's not that he included the racial element in it, but he did mention it kind of as a byproduct. He said to me, you know, you're getting ready to go into a world, speaking of the collegiate world of music now, he said, you're getting ready to go into a world where you can do naturally what it's taken the people around you years of study to get to. He said, what I'm telling you is to go into that world and take advantage of all of the education you can get, learn as much as you can there. Get all of it, absorb it, be a sponge. And I was told that even from my father growing up, be a sponge, soak up everything. Mm-hmm. Don't just be one thing. But at the same time, recognize that there are going to be people who are going to be envious of you because you already have this innate natural gift, and never lose sight of that. And also, my teacher would say, and also couple the fact that you're black, you know? So there is a sense in which I was aware early on of, you know, I always wanted to be a composer. I knew I wanted to be from the time I was 12, I knew I wanted to compose and write and organize music and do that. I knew that I wanted to do that, but I also understood the challenge that, you know, I was the only, at that point, black kid in my family who was going to college for a music degree that, as far as I know, actually graduated. So I was aware of the pressure there. I was aware that I was the only black kid in classes in most instances, and I'm pretty sure when I was going to the university, I was the only black kid in music school. That's not to say I didn't have friends. You know, I had friends, I had relationships that I cultivated there that are still with me to this day. But I was very aware, you know, that I was the only chocolate thing up in there. And on top of that, I knew who they were talking about. I knew that they were talking about Beethoven. I knew Mozart. I knew Stravinsky. I knew these people that they were talking about. And when I started to think about it, I said, you know, there's this other jazz part now. Because then when I started to study the jazz part of it, I'm like, well, it's interesting that, you know, Duke Ellington later, because they teach you music history, but it's very interesting that the American composers, the likes of Duke Ellington, often are not compared all the time in the same space as a Stravinsky or, you know, a Ravel or a Rachmaninoff or a Bartok or, you know, on and on and on, Debussy. Simply because they lived a different experience. And to be honest, there's a Eurocentrism in Western music that is inherent. When you go back to the basics of music history, the first things you're going to learn are Palestrina. Palestrina, who's, you know, the father of the modern Western contrapuntal system. You know, you're going to learn about J.S. Bach, who's the father of modern classical music. You're going to learn about Mozart. You're going to learn about Beethoven. You're going to learn about Chopin and Liszt and all this myriad of European composers. But what I found interesting is as I started to listen to some of these people and I would compare it with the jazz music I was hearing at the, let's say, just before the turn of the century during the Reformation period, even as far back as that, like the late 1880s, 1890s into the turn of the century. What you begin to hear is that the European composers were actually being influenced by the music they were hearing coming from the black musicians of America. And that is the part that I think could use a little bit more discussion in the collegiate world. Right.
Well, okay, yeah, I spent more time on Gregorian chant than I did.
Oh man.
Well, I'm curious too.
Yeah.
At least in my classical theory classes and history classes.
Yeah.
On that than modern Black American music.
Yeah.
Which a lot of it I could understand if it was just like straight ahead records that aren't particularly orchestrated.
Right.
A lot of improvisation, how that might not be particularly helpful.
Right.
But there's a ton of stuff coming out of the Ellington school of heavily composed chamber music.
Yeah.
And that stuff isn't touched on at all. At least in the core curriculum, it wasn't for me. And I'm also curious if the degree that you got, was it a jazz degree even, or was it just a general music degree?
Well, the degree I got was composition, but my composition teachers were smart enough to recognize that I was being pulled toward jazz because and I even started to understand. And for me, whenever I teach students or I talk to people and they ask me what jazz is or how I define it, I always say that the reason jazz is such a unique form is because it's the perfect marriage of African rhythm, African sensibility, African sort of tonalism with regard to how it sounds. It's the marriage of African rhythm and European harmony, the European harmonic approach. And in fact, a friend of mine, Rob Tinney, who I talk to all the time, he lives out in Spanish Fort, but we have discussions almost every day about music. And I remember one time we were having a discussion, and this is actually the kind of the inverse of what we're talking about, but it's very interesting. I began to listen to the music of Claude Debussy, and I began to notice that he was playing chordal structures that I had heard before. And I'm thinking, where have I heard this? And I'm digging deep, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, I've heard Herbie Hancock play this style of like sort of impressionistic chordal playing, I've heard him do it with Miles Davis and After. So where did he get it from? He got it from Bill Evans, you know, and all of the, you know, McCoy Tyner, Chick Corea in a sense, and Herbie, if you consider those three maybe the triumvirate of jazz piano from the 60s period, they were all influenced by Bill Evans. Bill Evans played on Kind of Blue, and the whole concept of Kind of Blue from a harmonic approach came from Debussy.
Yeah.
So I said to Rob Tinney one day, I said, so that means in a weird way that Debussy is actually the father or the grandfather, if you will, of modern jazz piano, because the concepts that he was playing with was what black musicians were gravitating towards, because the black pianists who were learning jazz first learned classical. So they had to learn classical literature. All they did was say, why can't we take this language and apply it to what we do in the blues and in funk and in jazz?
Yeah.
You know, why can't we do that? So jazz has always been a perfect marriage of the two cultures. But what's been interesting is any of sort of the American music institutions that are marriages of both those things, it's always interesting though that it's fermented first in the black community. And I think that's because when you lived, and I'm kind of extrapolating because I didn't live in that period, but I can only extrapolate that, you know, when you're a black person who's living in segregationist era America, you're told so many times what you can't do. Your life is totally relegated, and you're on top of that as a man, you're called boy. You're not even looked at as a man. And one of the, you know, sort of principles of manhood is that you're able to create your own destiny, shape your own life, make your own decisions. Well, for a black man living in segregationist era America, that was not a reality, because you had to go to the back door to go into the store. You had to, my dad talked about this, and this was such a trip to me. He actually talked about laughing barrels. Black men could not even laugh if a white person tripped over their own feet in the street. You couldn't do that. You had to put your head in a barrel and laugh. And it's like,
as in they had like actual barrels
set
up for such specific situations.
Yes. So that kind of gives you a picture of how restrained black life was. You couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, you couldn't go here. You had to be home before sundown. And it's interesting now because with the riots going on there, it's the exact same thing. You get messages on your phone now saying the curfew is in effect, so be inside before the sun goes down.
Right.
We're right back there again. So it's interesting that black musicians, the one thing that they had control over was how they took this European musical dialogue that they were getting from their teachers or even learning on their own, and saying, okay, I understand that a dominant chord, an F7 chord, a dominant seventh chord, is normally a dominant chord that resolves to a tonic, but why can't that just be its own sound?
Yeah.
Why can't that be its own thing? And in fact, in the language of blues, you need that chord. Blues does not exist, you know, without the dominant scale. And so it's very interesting to me that, you know, they were taking the language, they were taking the ideas of Debussy, but also their feelings of you know, the blues and the slave shanties, spirituals, all that, melding it together and creating this product that now they were able to play but not really fully enjoy the notoriety, fruits of the labor, some of the money in their own country where they invented it.
Yeah. You
know, they had to go to Europe to even be looked at as revolutionary.
Yeah. Well, man, okay, there's a lot there. One thing, I have to laugh though. I just saw your router, and I have the same one. Do you use Cox or for internet?
Oh, Xfinity.
Okay, they use the same router then, and I've been in like a 2-month trial of getting my Cox internet service canceled.
Wow.
And getting the router picked up when I'm not there and they aren't doing like pickup.
Yeah.
It's been a whole ordeal. That was just sorry.
Yeah. I had to take my old router back, and it was a thing. I had to just dump it in there. Yeah.
I had like a flashback moment of just anger when I saw that.
Rage on.
Yeah. But what I was gonna say is that it seems like nowadays when students are in music school and we do this thing where we just like shit on a bunch of music and we're like, that's not jazz, that is jazz. The first thing that it always is like, does it have a certain level of extended harmony where we can be like, that's jazz and that's not jazz, which is incredibly Eurocentric if you aren't thinking, does this have swing or elements of the Black American spirit and the rhythmic influences from Africa and any of that. It seems like that could be there, but if it's triadic based, it's like, oh, that's not jazz.
Well, I mean, if you go to somebody like Beethoven and you really sort of not so much research his compositions or the body of his work, because that's always going to be there, but if you really read about his life and what he dealt with, and I'm probably going down the conspiratorial rabbit hole, but there are records of Beethoven being made fun of for the color of his skin. You can go and read about this. I'm not saying particularly one way or the other, but I tend to believe that there might have been a strong indication that there was some African somewhere in Beethoven's ancestry, especially given, the fact that he was made fun of. They called him the Spaniard, or if they didn't call him the Spaniard, they called him the Moor, because his skin was sort of orange brownish complected, and he had pockmarks in his face that are they talked about it as like, I guess he had smallpox as a kid or something like that, and his face was pockmarked because of that. But actually, you can see that trait in sort of Central Africa. And also couple that with the fact that a historical event that doesn't really get covered so much is the Moorish conquering of Europe in the first, what do they call it? First millennia. Okay. But basically around the year 10 or the year 1000, that period, and I'm not specific on the dates, but somewhere between 700 and I think 10 or the year 1000. Basically during that time, the Moors from North Africa swept up through Portugal, Spain, and they got as far as Germany. And the Flemish country surrounding Germany. They conquered that, and they laid waste to it for like something like 700 years. I don't want to say laid waste. They conquered it. They colonized it in effect, and they brought so many of their cultural institutions that are now considered European commonplace things, such as soap, deodorant, indoor plumbing. Those are Moorish conventions that they brought to Europe. And so it would not surprise me that if you were able to research Beethoven's lineage, that maybe you find some Moorish ancestry. Because the other thing that Beethoven was called was the Moor. The reason I bring that up is that if you study his music from the heroic period, which is like that great burst of creativity that he had from like 1808 to around 1815, 1816. This is where we get our pieces like the 5th and 6th Symphony. If you really study, and the 7th Symphony, if you really study those pieces, what you find is that there's a swinging quality rhythmically to that music. And Beethoven was the great rhythmic pacer of all time in terms of how he set tempos and the feel of that thing. For instance, if you take the 9th Symphony, the second movement, which is a scherzo, and a fugal scherzo at that, the way that thing starts is bum-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum, That's a bembe. I used to play a game with myself when I was in college, and I used to like put Beethoven's Ninth Symphony on, or anything that, for instance, the first movement of the Seventh Symphony. And I used to imagine what would happen if you put, like, what's the drummer's name? Art Blakey. Behind that. You would get a bembe.
Yeah.
Or what would happen if you put Tony Williams or Jimmy Cobb back there and told them just play quarter notes? That's when it clicked for me. It's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. What Beethoven and Schumann and those guys were pushing for was what black people in America by the turn of the century started doing, which is adding this naturally swung rhythm. The natural evolution, in my opinion, of classical music was toward this swing rhythm. Things having the elasticity of time in music, you know. Even Europeans wanted to break away from time being rigid because they had this, you know, this duple thing, which is just very stiff, you know. But which is also very interesting because now if you go back further than the great classical period, now you're back to, let's say, Handel and Bach. And they had a style of music called the French Overture. And we used to get in fights in music history because they would break down the rhythm of the French Overture, which is, they said, well, it's, you know, it's a majestic, stately rhythm. And I'm looking at the thing on paper because they have it written out, you know, what the rhythm is in notation. And I'm like, that's a swing rhythm. It's a swing rhythm. Maybe you're not playing it as such, but it's a swing rhythm. I was like, I've heard Tony Williams play this on a ride cymbal, because if you examine the way Tony Williams plays a ride rhythm on swing, especially if it's medium tempo, he doesn't go ding ding ka ding ding ka ding. It's like he's milking that last eighth note for all it's worth. So it's like ding ga 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 ga, and I'm like, that's a French overture. That's what that is. And so it was very interesting to me. I was like, so basically, that's no accident. That's no accident. It can't be just that Europeans were in Europe coming up with their own thing, isolated from the rest of the world, especially when they came up with like the most intricate trade routes. I mean, the Silk Road. They had all of this access to Africa, to India. So why wouldn't there be this thing of cross-pollination of musical ideas from other parts of the world? And that then what you come to discover is that ultimately those rhythmic conventions in classical music are just reinterpretations of what they heard in other places that are black and brown places. Beethoven being, you know, using folk rhythms. Well, in his day, I imagine rather than being folk rhythms, they were probably called ethnic rhythms. You know, there was no reason before Beethoven to have a 6/8, you know, swinging that hard, da ba da da ba da 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 da, such that, you know, the da 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 of a 6/8. When Beethoven gets a hold of it, he puts the dotted rhythm in there, and then it's like hyper swing, da 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 da. It's like, whoa, you know, like he's infusing hyper swing into a swing rhythm already and making it swing even harder. So I'm just like, European composers have been using Afrocentric rhythmic conventions since the height of slavery. It's always been there. There's always been a piece of that in there. It's just we've never been taught to fully study that part of it. We've been taught to accept that these musicians were geniuses on their own, that they never received outside input, which to me is the biggest lie. Because if you're a composer, almost by default, it means that you're gathering your inspiration from outside source, because you have to observe life in order to write that into art. So I think, you know, everything that we're suffering now in terms of our thoughts about music, our interpretations of race, how we deal with that, ultimately stems from miseducation. And a need, and not only that, because I want to address the solution to that is re-education, reprogramming.
Right.
Because any behavior that can be learned can be unlearned. It's just you have to reprogram yourself.
Yeah. Well, and before, okay, that was all awesome, by the way. That was
Sorry,
super
I
cool.
went off on a tangent.
No, I loved all of it. That was like incredible. But I wanted to go back just to set the stage for reprogramming.
Yeah.
And just talk a little bit more about what I've experienced in Utah as far as people's perceptions and the subtle racism or just what's the right word? Ignorance.
Like that.
Yeah. I mean, I know, like in middle school and high school, like young Mormon kids who would not say a swear word, like would not do it, will like casually call each other the N-word as it's like it's a joke.
Yeah.
And that not in a way, like they also have like a moral high ground thing, like they are very assertive of their faith and how they think they view the world, and they wouldn't use language that they think is offensive, but they will use that word.
Yeah.
And like I graduated with 600 plus kids in my class, maybe 10 were black. It was just like entire friend groups where you just have no idea, and using that word and not using other ones. Like I think that's a blatant example of that subtleness of like just having no reference here. And I say that because I feel like I see a lot of people who grew up on Mountain Time expressing really strong opinions about what's going on. And the only advice I have is that like we just don't know. We have no idea what race relations are like growing up here as white people because we just haven't experienced like that. So it's weird to me to have such an emboldened opinion and a high ground of like I'm a devout church member and like I have no racist tendencies when like we should just be listening because we just don't know.
Well, the greatest I want to touch on a couple of areas there. The greatest disservice that the pandemic has done to America, the world in general, but America specifically, is it has removed or taken away our right and our ability to travel. I've grown up all my life in the United States. And for the first time a year ago, I believe, in September, I traveled outside, or the second time actually, excuse me. The second time I traveled outside the country. The first time I went to Jamaica.
Okay.
The second time I went to the Dominican Republic. And it was eye-opening that for the first time, it took me leaving the United States for the first time to actually feel that I belonged to the human race. Because I got to see people who looked like me and not feel out of place. Even though I didn't necessarily speak the language of the colloquial language of the area. Which, mind you, is not actually the original language of that area. If you're talking about the Dominican Republic now, Spanish is not their original language. It was given to them by Spanish and Italian conquerors. Yeah. So it's not their first language, but that's the language they speak now because of that. So, but they look like me. They have my complexion. They might have brighter eyes. You know, some of them had green eyes. Some of them had hazel eyes. But by and large, they look like me. That was a huge turning point for me to understand the concept of blackness. one of the things that white people and black people are going to have to come to terms with on different levels. Black people have to come to terms with it in this way. Black people have to reprogram themselves that blackness does not mean just them. Black does not mean, and it does not by default denote African American life, culture, and nationality. The word black, the term black, does not speak only to that paradigm. Blackness is a human trait. It's actually, if you think about it, and probably I'm going to anger some people when I say this, but black is the original human trait. Because the first humans that evolved and they're our ancestors. The first human beings were African. Mm-hmm. They came from sub-Saharan Africa. And on top of that, they were women. So what I'm saying is your great to the nth degree grandmother is African. You got to deal with that reality first. And if it's true that she's African, she's black because of where she lives. She lives in a place in the world where the temperature is warmer on average because it's near the equator. So she's going to get more sunlight. To protect her skin from that sunlight, her body is going to produce more melanocytes. And those melanocytes are going to produce more melanin to make her skin darker as a result of receiving more sunlight. But that melanin also kind of acts as a barrier to protect some of the UV getting in. So of course she's going to be black. That trait, as it spreads out from Africa into other parts of the world, becomes less needed because you're in colder parts of the climate. So your hair changes from, sort of a more curlier, texture, more coarse, to straighter. It loses its pigment because it doesn't require as much sunlight because you're colder. Your skin produces less melanin, therefore your skin starts to turn a whiter color because of where you're at in the climate. But as a human being, you come from an African. Know that first. And for white people, that is going to mean that the definition of blackness does not denote the stereotype that you've applied to what a black American is. Okay? So, having said that, the other piece to deal with is the N-word. In America, it's like nitroglycerin. It's literally like taking a Molotov cocktail bomb and throwing it against somebody's house and lighting the house ablaze. That's how powerful that word is. Now, what I will say is, to the generations of my family who came before me, that word has real power in the context of its hurt, the damage that's been caused by it, and the fact that that term has been used to economically suppress, as well as emotionally and psychologically.
Yeah.
It's been said that, if America ever had the sniffles or a cold, then black people have stage 4 cancer. And a lot of that has to do with the institutionalized racism. But to get back to the N-word, that word in its American context and how it was used against us has one definition, and that must always be respected. But again, because we're only taught history from 1776 up to now in our schools, and at that we're taught it wrong, we don't go back to what the word meant before 1300. Back when, because slavery actually goes back as far as 1300. The slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade started in Portugal and in Spain. It did not start with Britain. It started with Portugal, and it goes back as far back as 1300. And their word, the word marauder, comes from the black pirates, the Moors, the black pirates that would raid European ships.
Okay.
Marauder. So the Moors then became los negros, negro just meant black. But the term before that, and the term before that, and the term before that, in other words, walking the languages back, the N word is our word. But it's all about how the context applied to it meant. If you go back to the original word, that original word is negus, Negus, negus. And what it meant was the sovereign or the ruler of Ethiopia. So it's a connotative word. It's not a denotative word in its original language and thought. So now if that's true, then you have to figure in that the European colonizers who came to Africa saw the negus, the king of Ethiopia. They're not comfortable with the fact that black people rule their continent. Especially, they're not comfortable with that imagery. Especially if you're dealing with, people who up to this time in Europe, they live under the feudal system. So they're not really that thrilled about kings anyway. But on top of that, you got a black king who might actually be richer than you. That's a problem. So you take that word that connotes them, that's a connotation of them, and then you flip it to denote them. Especially when you strip them. Okay, we're gonna go to this country. We're gonna divide them against themselves as tribes to get them fighting in land wars with each other. The prisoners of war that they take will convince them to sell to us. That's how the transatlantic slave trade with America started. Get the African rulers, the negus, to sell himself, and we'll buy them and bring them to America and have them build America. And on top of that, the very word that they use to describe themselves as king, as sovereign, as God within, we're going to take and flip it and use it to describe them as the most wretched, the most lazy, the most shiftless, the subhuman. And so now in America, that word can't even be spoken. We don't even refer to it as what it is. And I'm not saying that everybody should have license to say it. In fact, I'm of the personal opinion that within the black community, there should be certain things that are just off limits that nobody gets to comment on because you don't live the experience. And this is going to sound a little forceful, but white people should be okay with that.
Yeah.
Because if you've had a 450-year head start on our backs, you don't get to police what we say about ourselves or to ourselves. That's a healing process that we have to do on our own as a community, and it takes us re-educating ourselves to what that word meant before the slave master applied it to us in his connotation. Everything that was given to us as African Americans was a connotation and a narrative, I should say, not a connotation, but a narrative that we didn't write. That's why we looked on Africa with disdain, even though we come from it. We were stolen from it. We were either stolen outright from it or sold from it by our African brothers. That's the truth, But we have to condition ourselves that we belong there. That's our motherland. That's who we are. And in fact, the ones that are captors of us, if they really understood the truth, that's who they are.
Yeah.
That's where they come from. There was a comedian that told a joke. He said that the slave trade started really because what happens is, it was Eddie Griffin. He said that, what happened is that in Africa, we drove the ones that were lighter skinned out. He said, well, what happens when you send the adopted child away? After a while, they're going to go come and find their real parents. Didn't they come and find us? And yes, it's very tongue-in-cheek what he's saying and laughing about it. But when you think about the need for human beings to connect, even though we do this nasty stuff to each other, there is that innate need to be connected with it in some way, even though you're conditioned to hate it or not stand it, in terms of like race relations between Europeans and Africans, or white people in America and black people in America. There is this sense in which you gravitate toward what you hate. And I think it's because you've been conditioned to hate it, but you haven't been conditioned to understand your pushback against it. In other words, I I don't like my preconceived. I'm conditioned not to like it based on my preconceptions, but there's something about that I want to understand it. It's just I don't have the humility to say, hey, I really don't understand. I need help. First of all, I need to humble myself to kind of understand some things about. I had a head start that they didn't get, so I need to kind of be like chill and be like, tell me what it is you've been through. You know, what is it like to be you? I could never understand it, but I at least want to listen to the narrative and let the narrative change my preconceived notion. So, I mean, as far as the N-word goes, yeah, it's a power-packed word, but again, education about the etymology of it, you know, the root of where it actually comes from, will help all of us understand how to communicate with each other, and why certain things should or should not be said. It's not just a matter of just policing somebody's free speech. It's that you got to understand the historical context of where that comes from.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about deprogramming and reprogramming, and one thing you had said in a post, this was pre-George Floyd and the protests, and you made a post just about some observations about yourself during the pandemic and lockdown, and just some truths that you've realized about your personality. And one of them that I really liked, that I think directly relates, is I can use more humility about life. I don't know everything, and that's frightening, but true. Therefore, it's okay to admit ignorance and what I don't know and ask for help so that I can be educated towards knowledge, and that will help feed self-assurance.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, directly in the musical world, admitting that you don't know everything makes it really empowering to reach out to better musicians and learn from them and grow and not be afraid of the things that you aren't good at, because those are the things that are going to help you become much better, because then you start working on them.
Right.
And then on the level of, I guess I see it as white people having the humility that we don't know everything about racial relations, and it's okay. It doesn't make us bad people to admit that, and open ourselves up to the idea of learning a lot more about this situation. I don't know. I think, I just keep coming back to listening and empathy, and there's just way too many people who are so convinced that the history that they've had, even if it was difficult, is so entrenched in this patriotic version of America where we're heroes in every sense of the word, and so tied to that giving way in any sense is really scary. And we could still be a great nation. You can be a great person and a patriot and be open to the idea that history of America isn't true for everyone, or maybe not true at all, and that you could listen and learn what someone else's history is.
Well, there you hit the nail on the head. It's not true at all. When you said that, you spoke more truth to yourself probably than you realized. Jane Elliott said something really profound, and I agree with her. She said, which, you know, for the listeners, Google Jane Elliott, look her up. She will help you if you're a white person trying to understand what it's like for people of color. Look her up on YouTube and everywhere. She will enlighten you. She's one of my favorite educators of all time. She's 85 now, I think, 85, 86.
Yeah.
But she said something really profound, and I agree with it. She said, if you're white and you went through the public education system of the United States and somehow you went through that and you're not racist, you're a miracle. Because either you figured out, either you didn't take the education that was given you, or the miseducation, let's say, that was given you, or you figured out that everything that was told to you was a lie. I'm in that category. I was always brought up believing that Dr. King was killed by a lone nut racist who was mad that he had integrated black people. It's a lie. You know, I was taught, first of all, I wasn't even taught about Malcolm X. But what I was taught about Malcolm X was that he was a black extremist who taught black supremacy. It's a lie. I was taught that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were great men. Insofar as they built a great experiment, that's true. But to say that they were great men who upheld the ideals of freedom and liberty and justice for all, it's a lie. And I've said this as well also on Facebook, if America is ever going to be the nation that it claims it is, it's going to have to deal with its original sin, not only towards black people, but Native Americans. Mm-hmm. As far as black people goes, that original sin is this. And pardon the sting of what I'm going to say. The original sin of America is that the man who wrote on paper on our Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson said that. He wrote that on paper, right? And this is he's one of our greatest founding fathers. He's the, I believe, third president of the United States. Founding father, wrote our Declaration of Independence. The original sin is that at the time he wrote that in 1776, at the time he wrote it, he owned 650 black people. That is the original sin of America. You cannot, and the reason I say it so strongly is because that means that what you put on paper is a lie. Mm-hmm. All men cannot be created equal if you own 650 of them and count them as 3/5 of a human.
Yeah.
That's a lie. And we, as Americans, have to own up to that and then make a decision. Are we going to be true to what was written on paper? Or are we just going to accept that what we wrote on paper, we never intended for the people that we bruised by writing that? Because what that means is if that's so, then all of what black people bled and died for to be counted into that statement is in vain. Because it was never intended for them. You have to deal with that. You have to deal with it. And it is an ignorance. It is an ignorance that we're all as Americans taught. You know, the 3/5 of a human, basically saying subhuman. Yeah. Because what part of a black person is good? Where's the other 2/5? You know, what is it? Part pig or something? What are we after that? And this is the anger. That is the anger that you see with black people who are out in the streets risking their lives, risking getting COVID. They're so tired of having to explain a basic truth like that. That the words you wrote for yourself, you never intended for us. That's the original sin. And the only way to repent of the original sin is to make that statement true. Either the Constitution is going to be law for everybody or nobody. You know, that's actually the real thing that I feel that Americans are threatened with. White Americans, I'll say, are really threatened with. If it's not true for black people, it can't really be true for anybody. There cannot be liberty and justice for all if it's not for everybody. You know, the interesting thing, the national anthem, if you want to talk about that, Francis Scott Key wrote that. I believe around during the War of 1812. It was during that period. And
I think I read today it was 1814.
1814. Yeah, my mistake. Yeah, 1814.
But it was
2 years after. Yeah.
Right, and every article I read had this like parenthetic statement of like a terribly named war for just so many confusing reasons.
Yeah, and again, we're not told the truth about that war. People often say that was the second war for independence from Britain, but basically it was about a land grab for Canada that didn't really fully materialize. But the interesting thing about that war is for a couple of generations now, America at that point has been a free nation, land of the free, home of the brave. You know, we have liberty now. We're a country now. We're working it out. Yeah, but you still own slaves. And you won't let them be free. And now you've got Britain breathing down your neck over Canada and all this other stuff. And what's interesting is that those same British people who, there's a couple things interesting. Number one, those same British people who had attacked America generations before in the American Revolution now came to black slaves and told them, if you'll fight with us against America, we'll give you your freedom. So a lot of black people ended up defecting. And really, it's not a defection, because if they're not seen as Americans, they're just doing whatever they can take advantage of to get their freedom. So it's not a defection, because their owners didn't see them as Americans anyway. In a way, that's poetic justice. Yeah. That they had to leave the land of the free just to be free. You got that thing. Then the third verse of the national anthem basically talks about there's no refuge can save the hireling or slave from the terror of night or the gloom of the grave. The reason he wrote that is because he was on the enemy ship. He had been captured, I think, and he was on the enemy ship observing the bombardment of, I believe it was Fort McKinney. I think it was one of those forts off the coast, coast. And the men below were watching, they couldn't see, so they would holler up, is the flag still in the sky? The prisoners of war there on the ship. Is the flag still in the air? That flag, because the British objective there was to blow that flag out of the sky, because it would be a symbol that they had conquered this free nation. So they're throwing cannons and every cannon fire, cannonballs, all this fire bombing at them. That's where our first verse comes from. The rockets, red glare, the bombs bursting in air. That's what that is. Throwing the bombs at the flag. They could not blow the flag or the flagpole down. And when Francis Scott Key arrived next morning to the site of the fort, the flag was bent on like a 45 to 55 degree angle, but the flag was still in the sky waving. But at the base of that flag were the slain bodies and the mutilated corpses and the blood of indentured black slaves who were ordered to go down there and hold that flagpole up from being blown out of the sky. So, in a sense, the true patriots are those people who died for a freedom they couldn't even enjoy, and they were ordered to do it. So there had to be something within them that, even though they couldn't enjoy the freedom, they at least believed enough in the concept that they went down there and risked their lives. They got blown apart by British fire. For us, 200 some odd years later, to stand, put our hand on our heart, and say, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light? The song's not even about us. Francis Scott Key was a slave owner as well, writing that no refuge could save the hireling or slave. And he wrote that with he was braggadocious about that.
Well, yeah, and I read there at one point was an additional verse added to include the existence and homage to Black Americans that
the fourth verse.
Then, people in the South got all up in arms about, and it disappeared.
Yeah. I mean, it is about the concealing of that original sin that keeps us where we are now. And it's very, very interesting as I examine what could be done to repair that. I believe there's a lot to be done to repair that. It used to be that I was, and I'm still for some form of reparations. I actually am. But I now, even as we're talking about it, I'm leaning more towards the ideal that the first thing that needs to happen is that we, as a country, first of all, we as Black people, my own people, we have to re-educate ourselves. We have some self-healing to do as a culture apart from. And it's hard to say that, but it really has to happen apart from. the homogenous culture, because there's so much that we carry with us psychologically, emotionally, mentally, that reinforces how we deal financially, politically, socially with ourselves and with our white counterparts. There's so much healing that has to happen. Black folk need serious therapy to deal with the trauma that has the trauma from the Willie Lynch letter. We have some serious, but then once we do that, then there has to be this thing of where white folk and black folk can come to a table and feel as though they are in a safe enough of a space to air their grievances with one another, you know, and be able to come to some sort of resolution about what type of American are we going to become, you know. Martin Luther King is one of my favorite subjects to talk about, mainly because white people bring him up more than black people do at this point.
Yeah.
And that's a fact.
You can. My Facebook feed confirms that.
Yeah, right? I'm not including you in this when I say y'all, but y'all love to bring him up more than anybody else. But the truth of the matter is, when you have to really read about what was going on with him in the last year of his life. See, the problem that I have with people bringing up Dr. King is that they only want us to deal with Dr. King from 1955 to 1965. They want us to deal with the pacifist king. And I'm not even going to say pacifist, the nonviolent resistant king, the one who who organized the marches and preached to his Negro brethren, whatever they do, don't fight back, you know, but keep moving forward. They want that one. They want the one who stood on, and I actually went to DC in the National Mall and stood at the place where he gave that I Have a Dream speech. Mm-hmm. And it moved me deeply that I was at the place where one of my heroes had been. But if all you go with is that, you're not getting the full contextual picture of Dr. King. One of the things that you need to understand about Dr. King was no idiot. He understood that this approach might not work. And if it doesn't work, then we as black people need to be prepared to defend ourselves. The SCLC, which he formed with Ralph Abernathy, they kept a stockpile of weapons. In various offices and chapters, they had stockpiles of weapons, because if it ever got down to a place where they were just mercilessly killing black people, they were going to brandish those weapons and defend themselves. So Martin King was very, very smart. He was not an idiot. The other thing, when you look at what he was, the big thing for me is, why was he really assassinated? Can't be because of the lone racist. Because first of all, in that time, there was no lone racist. That statement is made to absolve white people of their guilt. Because if you look at the year to the day of his assassination, in April 4th, 1967, he gave a sermon in Riverside Church in New York. And Dr. King said in that speech, "I'm here to tell you tonight, brothers and sisters, that America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today." When he took that firm stance against the Vietnam War with that statement, and then in his own church he said, don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. The moment he said that, he was marked for death. Not because he wanted to integrate some lunch counters and some restaurants and some theaters. It had nothing to do with that. What it had to do with is he was working on something called the Poor People's Campaign. Because what he was in effect saying in that last year of his life is that it is morally wrong for the United States government, as they're doing now, it is wrong for them to afford billions of dollars to the military industrial complex. When we're not in, whether we're in a state of war or not, it is sinful to allot that much money to a bully military. Mm-hmm. and not set aside any of that funding for blacks to go to school, blacks to have decent housing, and poor whites, mind you.
Yeah.
To have decent shelter, decent clothing, decent stores, a decent neighborhood where they can go to the park, decent restaurants. In other words, he was asking for a social, economic stimulus package for the working class. Mm-hmm. And for that, the United States government, in connection with the Ku Klux Klan of Tennessee and the Memphis Police Department, they coalesced and they killed Dr. King. There's a book by William Pepper, and I can't remember the title, but if you look up William Pepper, Google him, he was the attorney for the King family. And he wrote a series of books on Martin Luther King's assassination, and they will give you great insight as to why King was really killed and actually what happened. As I've come to understand it, according to William Pepper, Martin Luther King actually survived the shooting on the balcony. He was actually killed at the hospital by a doctor who held a pillow over his face. The sad travesty is that we're not told this in the news, because there's an official story that America wants to run with to keep Dr. King's legacy polished and to absolve their hands of any complicity in his murder. But he was murdered for a poor people's campaign. He was coming to get that check. He was coming to get that check. And had he been successful, the fear is that if he pulled off that Poor People's March, the second march on Washington, successfully, his next aspirations would have been to run for President of the United States. That was a real fear for Lyndon B. Johnson and his administration. That was a real fear, such that in 1967 and 68, Martin Luther King was declared public enemy number 1 by the state.
Yeah.
He was the most hated man, black or white, in America.
Yeah, and then that's the name that people are quoting to judge people for protesting as they are.
And that's very interesting, because now if you consider all of that is true, then you got to look at what he said the night before he was killed. See, that's what I'm saying. You have to take Dr. King in full context. What you start with is Malcolm's death in 65. Malcolm's death had a profound effect on Martin King and his whole approach. Everything changed for him after Malcolm was killed, because Martin began to understand what Malcolm was actually speaking to. And what Malcolm understood is that it's not just about civil rights for black people. It's that black people need to be seen as human. It's a human rights issue. After Malcolm's death, Martin went to Jamaica and he visited the gravesite of Marcus Garvey, probably one of the greatest civil rights black leaders in the 20th century, even above Martin and Malcolm, because Malcolm and Martin's parents were Garveyites. And you have to research and find out more about what Marcus Garvey was about. But after he came back from that trip in Jamaica, it's almost as if the light bulb came on and Martin started to have a reawakening. And some of his speeches, while he was still committed to nonviolent resistance, he started to infuse a little bit of Malcolm's ideas into his speeches, in that it is wrong for white people to have had a 450-year head start and blacks have nothing to go on, but you keep telling us to pull us up by our bootstraps, and we have nothing. We don't even have boots. How are we going to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps? So that whole energy is following King into 66, 67, leading up to his assassination. And now we're up to April 3rd, 1968, the speech at the Masonic Temple. And the media really angers me whenever they show that speech on TV, because they only cut right to the part where he predicted his death a day later, where he says, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." They only show you that part. They don't show you what he said before all of that. You have to take that, any speech that Malcolm or Martin gave, you have to give in full, you have to have it in full context. What Dr. King said was this. He said, "All we say to America is to be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or any other totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they've committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read, and this is relevant to now. I'm coming out of the quote now, but now I'm jumping back in. This is relevant to now. But somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. Then he goes into, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything and I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the Lord. And a day later, he was dead. Wow. So when you take that into context, that speech wasn't just about him leaving the black community leaderless, which is the story that they want us to go with. What he was doing was he was preaching to America and saying, what we're asking for is nothing more or less than what's within our rights. We have the right to petition the government. And this is why you need a Malcolm to balance a Martin out. Because Malcolm's piece to that was, if we have the right to petition the government simply to ask for what is right, and if the government gets to a place where it's either unwilling or unable to uphold that right, then the people, and this is right out of the Constitution, the people have the right to defend themselves by any means necessary. Look at where we're at now.
That does it for part one of this interview with Courtney Isaiah Smith. You can find links to everything he referenced, including the featured tracks from this interview. They're straight from Courtney's SoundCloud. The first one was Straight Struttin', and the second one is Highland Chant. You can find those at thehappymusicians.com. And you can find more information about us at our social media pages at The Happy Musicians on Facebook and Instagram. You can use our hashtag #HappyMusician for all your posts. Hope you join us for the next episode. There's plenty of more incredible information coming from Courtney. Thank you for your time and your attention. Black Lives Matter. Keep getting educated and stay happy. Thanks.